When a billionaire CEO jokingly asked her janitor to fix her frozen computer, she had no idea this quiet man held the secret that built her entire empire. What happens next will leave you speechless. Before we dive in, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss stories like this. Trust me, you'll want to hear every word of what happens next. Maybe the security guard wants to try fixing it, since apparently my entire IT department is just here for the free coffee. The words cut through the conference room like a blade through silk, sharp and effortless, delivered without even a glance up from the phone in her hand. Rebecca Hartman didn't need to raise her voice to command attention. 30 years of building empires from nothing had taught her that power whispers, it never shouts. She sat at the head of the obsidian table in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people earned in a month, her perfectly manicured fingers scrolling through emails while her entire executive team held its collective breath. The young IT specialist hovering over her frozen laptop looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole, his face flushing crimson as he jabbed uselessly at keys that refused to respond. Around the table, 12 faces exchanged the kind of uncomfortable glances that come when someone's about to be humiliated, and everyone knows it, but no one dares intervene. The only sound was the soft clink of a trash bin being emptied near the corner, where a figure in gray maintenance coveralls worked quietly, methodically, as if the drama unfolding mere feet away existed in an entirely different universe. Rebecca finally looked up, her ice-blue eyes scanning the room with the precision of a surgeon selecting exactly where to cut. Her gaze landed on the man with the trash bin, and something flickered across her face, not quite curiosity, not quite amusement, but something in between that made everyone shift in their seats. "Mr. Fisher, isn't it?" Her voice carried that particular tone of someone who already knows the answer but enjoys watching people squirm anyway. The man straightened slowly, and for the first time, the executives really looked at him. Tall, probably late 30s, with hands that looked like they'd seen more than their share of hard work and eyes that held the kind of quiet depth that comes from carrying secrets too heavy to share. His name tag read simply Thomas, printed slightly crooked as if whoever made it hadn't cared enough to get it right. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, his voice steady and calm in a way that seemed almost incongruous with his position. There was no nervousness, no stammering, just a simple acknowledgement that made Rebecca tilt her head slightly, like a chess player recognizing an unexpected move. She gestured toward the laptop with one elegant hand, her lips curving into what might have been a smile if it had contained any actual warmth. "Care to take a crack at it?" The room went absolutely still. Everyone expected him to decline, to offer some polite excuse and return to his trash bin and his invisible existence in the background of their important lives. Instead, Thomas Fisher set down his work, wiped his hands on his coveralls, and walked forward with the kind of quiet confidence that belongs to people who have nothing left to prove and nothing left to lose. He pulled out the leather chair opposite Rebecca, the one usually reserved for the CFO, and sat down as if he'd done it 1,000 times before. The laptop sat between them like a gauntlet thrown, its screen frozen on a critical presentation file that the entire board needed to see in exactly 90 minutes. "I'll take a look," Thomas said simply, his fingers already moving across the keyboard with a speed and precision that made the IT specialist's jaw drop. Within seconds, he'd navigated to a command prompt that half the people in the room didn't even know existed, his fingers dancing across keys and patterns that seemed almost choreographed. Someone near the end of the table cleared their throat nervously. Someone else reached for their water glass and missed, sending droplets across their legal pad. Rebecca leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, watching with an expression that gave away absolutely nothing, though her eyes never left the screen or the man working on it. "You're running a beta operating system on production hardware," Thomas said quietly, his eyes still on the screen as lines of code scrolled past faster than most people could read. "There's a driver conflict with your security protocols. It's creating a memory leak that locks up the entire system." He paused, fingers hovering over the keyboard. "This happened because someone pushed an update without testing it against your custom applications first." The IT specialist made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a whimper. Rebecca's eyebrow rose a fraction of an inch. The silence in the room shifted from uncomfortable to absolutely electric, the kind of tension that comes when everyone realizes they're watching something that shouldn't be possible. Thomas's fingers flew across the keyboard, entering commands that made the screen flicker and dance with information that looked more like the Matrix than anything anyone associated with fixing computers. 3 minutes passed, then 5. The clock on the wall ticked audibly in the silence, each second feeling like an hour. Then, without fanfare or announcement, the screen blinked, refreshed, and came back to life, displaying the presentation file perfectly intact and fully functional. The collective exhale from the executive team was audible, but Thomas wasn't finished. His eyes had caught something, a folder that shouldn't have been there, sitting in the system's recovery partition where no one should have been able to put anything. His hand moved toward it, and that's when Rebecca spoke, her voice sharp for the first time. "Don't open that." He opened it anyway. The file that appeared was unlike anything anyone in that room had seen before. Pure code, elegant and complex, scrolling across the screen in patterns that seemed almost organic, as if the programming itself were alive and breathing. Rebecca leaned forward despite herself, her carefully maintained composure cracking just enough to show genuine surprise. "What is this?" she asked, and for the first time since anyone could remember, Rebecca Hartman sounded uncertain. Thomas closed the file with a single keystroke, pushed the chair back under the table with deliberate care, and stood. His face was unreadable, but his eyes held something that might have been sadness, or anger, or perhaps just exhaustion. "That's your problem now," he said quietly, and then he turned and walked out of the conference room, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt like the air itself had stopped moving. Rebecca stared at the closed door, then at the laptop, then at the frozen faces around her table. She opened her mouth to say something, stopped, and instead reached for the laptop, her fingers already pulling up file properties, metadata, anything that could tell her what she'd just seen. And that's when she saw it, buried in the code's digital signature, a name she hadn't thought about in years, a name that should have been impossible. Thomas Michael Fisher, lead systems architect, 2014. Her blood ran cold. Rebecca Hartman had built her entire career on never showing weakness, on never letting anyone see her rattled. But as she sat alone in her corner office 3 hours after that conference room encounter, she couldn't stop her hands from trembling slightly as they hovered over the keyboard. The city sprawled beneath her floor-to-ceiling windows, a glittering monument to ambition and success. But for the first time in years, she wasn't seeing it. All she could see was that name burning in her mind like a brand. Thomas Michael Fisher, lead systems architect, 2014. That was impossible. That had to be impossible. The year 2014 was when her father was still alive, still running the company with an iron fist and impossible standards. It was the year before Rebecca had taken over, before she'd proven herself worthy of the Hartman name, before she'd transformed a struggling tech firm into a billion-dollar empire. It was also the year that everything had changed in ways she'd never fully understood, the year her father had suddenly pivoted the company's entire direction, the year they'd launched the revolutionary predictive analytics system that had made them industry leaders, the year that questions had been asked but never quite answered about where that breakthrough technology had actually come from. She pulled up the company's archived personnel files, her security clearance giving her access to records that went back decades, and she typed in his name with fingers that felt disconnected from her body. The file that appeared was frustratingly thin, almost deliberately sparse, just a standard employment form showing Thomas Fisher had worked in their research division from 2012 to 2014, with a departure marked as voluntary resignation and no forwarding information beyond a phone number that was probably long disconnected. But there was something else, a small notation in the margin that most people would have missed, a reference number that linked to another file, one marked with her father's personal access code. Rebecca's father had been many things: brilliant, ruthless, demanding, but he'd also been meticulous about documentation, about keeping records of everything that mattered. If he'd flagged Thomas Fisher's file personally, there was a reason. She used her inherited administrative access to open the secondary file, and what she found made the room spin slightly. Internal memo, dated March 2014, from her father to the legal department. Subject line reading simply acquisition of intellectual property. And in the body of the memo, clinical and cold as always, instructions to ensure all research materials developed by T. Fisher during his employment be transferred to company ownership upon his departure, regardless of any objections. and to have legal documentation prepared to prevent future claims. Rebecca sat back in her chair, the leather creaking softly in the silent office, and felt something cold settle in her stomach. Her father had taken something significant enough to require legal maneuvering, something valuable enough to build an empire on. She thought about the predictive analytics system that had made Hartman Technologies a household name, the elegant algorithm that could anticipate system failures before they happened, that had revolutionized everything from hospital equipment monitoring to industrial safety systems. She'd always been told her father had developed it, that his brilliant mind had created the breakthrough that changed everything. But now, staring at that memo, she wondered what else she'd been told that wasn't quite true. The intercom on her desk buzzed, making her jump. She never jumped. Ms. Hartman, her assistant's voice came through, professional and slightly concerned. You asked me to notify you if Mr. Fisher left the building. He just exited through the service entrance with a young girl, approximately 7 years old. Rebecca's finger hovered over the response button. A daughter. Of course he had a daughter. Thank you, Rachel, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. That will be all for tonight. She turned back to her computer and did something she hadn't done in years. She went down a rabbit hole of public records, court filings, news archives, anything she could find about Thomas Fisher that existed outside the carefully sanitized corporate files. What she found made her chest tighten. There was a marriage license from 2011, Thomas Michael Fisher to Anna Marie Fisher. There was a birth certificate from 2016, Emma Claire Fisher, Mother Anna, Father Thomas. And then there was an obituary from 2015, Anna Marie Fisher, age 32, died unexpectedly from complications during a routine medical procedure, survived by her husband Thomas and infant daughter Emma. The obituary mentioned that Anna had been a patient advocate, that she'd worked in hospital safety oversight, that she'd dedicated her life to making sure medical systems worked properly to protect patients. Rebecca felt sick. The timeline was brutally clear now. Thomas had been working on predictive systems for medical equipment in 2014, systems designed to prevent exactly the kind of failure that might lead to complications during routine procedures. Her father had taken that work, had pushed Thomas out, had commercialized the technology. And then, a year later, Thomas's wife had died from the very kind of preventable failure his system was designed to detect. The next morning, Rebecca arrived at the office before dawn, before the executive team, before the endless parade of meetings and decisions that usually consumed her days. She went straight to the sublevels, to the maintenance areas where the invisible workforce that kept her gleaming tower running worked their overnight shifts. She found Thomas in a supply room that was unnaturally organized, every tool in its place, every surface clean, a small cork board on one wall covered with children's drawings, rockets and rainbows, and stick figure families holding hands under smiling suns. He was restocking cleaning supplies with methodical precision, and he didn't turn around when she entered, though she knew he'd heard her heels clicking on the concrete floor. The drawings made her throat tight. One of them showed a tall man and a small girl standing in front of a massive building, and written in careful child's handwriting across the top, "Daddy's work." "You could have sued us," Rebecca said quietly, dispensing with any pretense of small talk. "You could have fought for credit, for compensation, for anything. You had grounds." Thomas continued his work, his back still to her. "Could have," he agreed, his voice neutral. "Chose not to." "Why?" He finally turned, and his eyes were tired but not angry, sad but not broken. "Because suing your father wouldn't have brought her back. Fighting for credit wouldn't have changed what the system failed to do when it mattered. And dragging myself through years of legal battles while raising a daughter alone seemed like a good way to lose what little I had left." Rebecca felt tears prick her eyes and force them back. Hartman women didn't cry. Her father had always said, they acted. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it more than she'd meant anything in years. "For your wife. For what my father did. For all of it." Thomas studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the harsh fluorescent lighting of the supply room, and Rebecca found herself holding her breath without knowing why. "Sorry doesn't debug code," he said finally, but his voice wasn't cruel, just matter of fact, like he was explaining a technical problem to someone who didn't quite understand the architecture. "Your father understood that better than anyone. He understood that intentions don't matter, only results do. And the result is that a system I built to save lives like Anna's got buried in paperwork and profit margins until it was too late for the one person I actually built it for. He turned back to his supplies, and Rebecca watched his shoulders tense slightly, the only sign that talking about this cost him anything at all. After Anna died, I spent 6 months trying to understand what went wrong. The hospital used an older monitoring system, one that should have caught her blood pressure dropping during the procedure, but didn't. I pulled every record I could get my hands on, talked to every person who'd touch her case, and you know what I found? Nothing. No malfunction, no error, no smoking gun. Just a system that worked exactly as it was designed to work, which wasn't good enough. That's when I realized that all my brilliant code, all my elegant algorithms, all the work your father had taken, none of it mattered if it wasn't actually in the places where people needed it most. Rebecca leaned against the doorframe, her expensive suit feeling absurd in this utilitarian space, and asked the question that had been burning in her mind since yesterday. Why did you come back? Why work here, of all places, doing this? Thomas let out a breath that might have been a laugh if it had contained any humor. Because I needed a job with health insurance and flexible hours so I could take care of Emma. Because nobody asks questions when you're just the maintenance guy. Because sometimes the best way to hide from your past is to walk right back into it and become invisible. He finally met her eyes again, and there was something in his gaze that made her feel like he could see straight through all her careful defenses. And maybe because some part of me wanted to see what became of the work I'd left behind, even if watching it from the shadows was all I could manage. The honesty of it hit her like a physical blow. She thought about all the times she'd walked past maintenance workers without seeing them, all the people who kept her world running while remaining utterly invisible to her. She thought about her father, who'd built an empire on the backs of people like Thomas and never lost a single night's sleep over it. And she thought about Emma, that little girl with the crayon drawings, growing up knowing her father was brilliant, but watching him mop floors because the world had chewed him up and decided he wasn't worth remembering. Rebecca straightened, decision crystallizing in her mind with the kind of clarity she usually reserved for boardroom strategies. I want to make this right, she said firmly. I don't know how yet, but I'm going to figure it out. I'm going to find out exactly what my father took from you, and I'm going to make sure the world knows where it really came from. Thomas shook his head slowly. You can't give back 7 years, Rebecca. You can't undo what's already done. The system is out there now, saving lives maybe, I hope. Putting my name on it doesn't change the fact that Anna never got to benefit from it. It doesn't change the fact that Emma grew up without her mother. It doesn't change anything that actually matters. Maybe not, Rebecca conceded, but it changes the future. It changes what we build next. It changes whether we keep perpetuating the same patterns or whether we finally break them. She took a step closer, her voice dropping to something almost vulnerable. My father taught me that success meant winning at any cost, that business was war and casualties were inevitable. But standing here, looking at what that philosophy actually cost, I don't want to be that person anymore. I don't want to build empires on buried bodies and stolen dreams. I want to build something that actually deserves to exist. For the first time, something shifted in Thomas's expression, not hope exactly, but maybe the distant cousin of hope, the thing that whispers that maybe, possibly, against all odds, things could be different. What exactly are you proposing? He asked carefully. Rebecca pulled out her phone and opened the file she'd been studying all night. The recovered code from the laptop, the elegant architecture that her entire company had been built on without ever understanding its true source. This system you created, she said, showing him the screen, it's more advanced than anything my team has managed to produce in the 7 years since you left. The core logic is brilliant, but it's incomplete, like someone had to stop working on it before they could finish what they'd started. I want you to finish it. I want you to build what you originally envisioned, not as my employee, not as someone I own, but as a partner, as the person whose vision this actually was. Thomas looked at the screen, and she saw his fingers twitch slightly, the muscle memory of a craftsman seeing unfinished work. Then he looked at her skeptically. And when your board finds out you want to partner with the janitor, when your investors hear that the foundation of your flagship product was stolen intellectual property, when the press gets hold of this story, what then? Then we tell the truth, Rebecca said simply. We admit what my father did. We face whatever consequences come from that. And we build the next generation of this technology the right way, with transparency and integrity and your name on every patent, and press release. Thomas was quiet for a long time, and Rebecca could almost see him weighing possibilities, calculating risks, trying to decide if this was real or just another elaborate way for the powerful to use him and discard him when convenient. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and careful. "I need two things from you before I even consider this. First, whatever we build, it gets deployed in public hospitals and underserved communities first, not just sold to the highest bidder. If we're going to do this, it actually has to help people who need help, not just people who can afford premium healthcare packages." Rebecca nodded immediately. "Done. What's the second thing?" Thomas's jaw tightened slightly. "I need you to promise me that if this goes sideways, if the board revolts or the company collapses, or any of the 100 disasters that could happen actually happen, you'll make sure Emma is taken care of. Not with money, though that helps with opportunity. With a chance at a future that doesn't involve watching her dreams get stolen by people who think ownership means more than creation." Rebecca met his eyes and saw the fierce protectiveness there, the love that had kept him going through 7 years of invisible existence. And she made a promise she intended to keep even if it cost her everything. "I give you my word," she said, "not as a CEO, but as someone who's finally understanding what actually matters. Emma will have every opportunity one can possibly give her, and more importantly, she'll grow up seeing that doing the right thing, even when it's hard, even when it costs you, is always worth it in the end." The emergency board meeting was called for 8 in the morning, but Rebecca had been in her office since 5. Preparing for a battle she knew would define everything that came after. She'd spent the previous week doing something she'd never done before: actual investigative work, digging through archives and old emails, tracking down former employees who'd worked with Thomas, piecing together a story that her father had spent considerable effort to bury. What she'd found was worse than she'd imagined. Her father hadn't just taken Thomas's work, he'd systematically dismantled the young engineer's credibility, planting seeds of doubt about his competence, ensuring that when Thomas left, no one would believe his claims if he ever decided to make them. There were emails suggesting Thomas was unstable after his wife's death, memos questioning his judgment, performance reviews that suddenly turned critical after years of exemplary ratings. It was character assassination carried out with corporate precision, and Rebecca felt physically ill reading through the evidence of her father's calculated cruelty. But she'd also found something else. Something her father probably never expected anyone to discover: a series of encrypted files on an old backup server. Files that contained the original development logs for the predictive system, complete with timestamps and author signatures that proved beyond any doubt that Thomas Fisher had created the core technology that Hartman Technologies was built on. She'd brought all of it to the boardroom that morning, every piece of evidence carefully organized, every timeline meticulously documented. And now she stood at the head of the table facing 12 people who'd made fortunes from the company her father built and who had absolutely no incentive to care about how those fortunes were made. Daniel Kowalski, the chief technology officer and her father's oldest friend, sat directly across from her with his arms crossed and his expression already hostile before she'd even begun. Gregory Walsh, the CFO who'd been with the company since before Rebecca was born, kept checking his watch as if this meeting was an inconvenience he couldn't wait to escape. And there, near the end of the table, was Sarah Chun, the general counsel who'd helped draft every contract and navigate every legal challenge for the past 15 years, her face carefully neutral, but her eyes sharp and calculating. Rebecca took a deep breath and began. "Thank you all for coming on short notice. I've called this meeting because I've discovered something about our company's history that requires immediate action and complete transparency." She clicked a button, and the screen behind her lit up with the first slide: Thomas's employment record, the sparse file that had started her investigation. This is Thomas Fisher. Some of you may remember him from his time in our research division between 2012 and 2014. Most of you probably don't, because after he left, his contributions were systematically erased from our corporate narrative. Daniel Kowalski shifted in his seat, his expression darkening. "Rebecca, if this is about some disgruntled former employee making claims, I really don't think." "It's not claims," Rebecca cut him off smoothly. "It's facts. Documented, verifiable, incontrovertible facts." She advanced to the next slide, showing the development logs with Thomas's signature all over them. Thomas Fisher was the lead architect of our predictive analytics system. Not a contributor, not a team member the lead architect. The core algorithms, the learning models, the entire foundational structure came from his work. My father knew this, documented it internally, and then took deliberate steps to ensure Thomas received no credit and had no legal recourse to fight for it. The room erupted. Gregory Walsh stood up, his face reddening. This is absurd. Your father built this company from nothing. He was the visionary behind our success. Rebecca met his anger with cold calm. My father was many things, but the visionary behind our flagship technology wasn't one of them. That was Thomas Fisher, and the evidence is irrefutable. She spent the next 20 minutes walking them through everything she'd found, every email, every memo, every piece of documentation that painted a picture of systematic intellectual property theft. She showed them the timeline: how Thomas's wife had died shortly after he left the company, how he'd disappeared from the tech world entirely, how he'd resurfaced years later working maintenance jobs under the radar. And then she told them the part that made several board members go pale. He's been working here, in this building, for the past 3 years, as part of our maintenance staff, under our noses the entire time. Sarah Chun leaned forward, her lawyer's mind already working through implications. Rebecca, even if everything you're saying is true, and I'm not conceding that it is, bringing this up now could expose the company to massive legal liability. We're talking about potential lawsuits, shareholder revolts, criminal investigations into your father's conduct. The smart play here is to quietly settle with Mr. Fisher, have him sign an NDA, and move on. Rebecca had expected this, had prepared for this exact argument. The smart play, she replied, her voice hard as steel, is to do the right thing regardless of the cost. Because if we don't, if we try to bury this again, someone else will eventually find it. A journalist, a competitor, a whistleblower, someone will dig this up and expose it. And when that happens, we won't just face legal liability. We'll face complete destruction of our reputation and everything we've built. At least if we control the narrative, if we come forward with honesty and a plan to make things right, we have a chance of surviving with our integrity intact. Daniel Kowalski laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. Integrity? Rebecca, this is business, not Sunday school. Your father understood that. He made the hard choices necessary to build something great. And now you want to tear it all down because of some misplaced sense of guilt? Rebecca felt her temper flare, but kept it controlled. My father built an empire on stolen work and ruined lives. That's not greatness, Daniel. That's theft with better marketing. The room went absolutely silent. Rebecca could see the calculation happening behind every pair of eyes, the mental math of loyalty versus liability, principle versus profit. Then Sarah Chin spoke again, her voice carefully measured. What exactly are you proposing, Rebecca? Walk us through your vision for how this plays out. Rebecca advanced to her final slide, the one she'd worked on until 3 a.m, the comprehensive plan that would either save the company or destroy it. We come clean publicly. We issue a statement acknowledging that our core technology was developed by Thomas Fisher and that he was not properly credited or compensated. We offer him a full partnership position, not as an employee, but as a co-owner of the intellectual property he created. We establish a foundation in his wife's name dedicated to improving safety systems in underserved medical facilities. And we commit to transparent, ethical development practices going forward, with independent oversight to ensure we never repeat my father's mistakes. The silence that followed was deafening. Then Gregory Walsh spoke, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. You're asking us to commit corporate suicide, to admit to theft, to expose ourselves to unlimited legal liability, to potentially wipe out billions in shareholder value. For what? For some moral high ground that won't mean anything when we're bankrupt and broken? Rebecca looked at each of them in turn. These people who'd benefited from her father's ruthlessness, who'd built their careers on foundations of sand and lies. Maybe, she said quietly, or maybe I'm asking us to finally build something worth believing in. Something that doesn't require us to avoid mirrors and ignore the bodies we step over on our way to success. The vote will be held in 1 week. Between now and then, I suggest you all think very carefully about what kind of company you want to be part of and what kind of legacy you want to leave. Because I promise you this, I am moving forward with this whether you vote with me or against me. The only question is whether you'll be part of the solution or part of the problem. The week that followed felt like walking through a minefield blindfolded, every step potentially catastrophic. every conversation loaded with subtext and hidden agendas. Rebecca had expected resistance, but what she hadn't anticipated was the sheer creativity of the opposition's tactics. Daniel Kowalski had been working behind the scenes, she discovered, meeting with major shareholders, planting seeds of doubt about her leadership, suggesting that grief over her father's death had clouded her judgment and made her vulnerable to manipulation by opportunistic former employees. Gregory Walsh had commissioned an independent valuation that projected the company would lose 40% of its market value if they admitted to the intellectual property issues, a number he'd somehow leaked to 3 different financial news outlets, who were now circling like sharks sensing blood in the water. And Sarah Chun, ever the pragmatist, had been quietly preparing 2 sets of legal documents, one for the scenario where Rebecca won and they needed damage control, another for the scenario where the board voted her out and they needed to bury this whole mess as deep as legally possible. But Rebecca wasn't her father's daughter for nothing, and she'd learned a few things about playing corporate chess during her years fighting for respect in boardrooms full of men who thought her position was inherited privilege rather than earned right. She'd reached out to every contact she had in the tech journalism world, carefully leaking pieces of the story with just enough detail to make it clear that something significant was coming, building anticipation and public interest that would make it nearly impossible for the board to simply sweep things under the rug, even if they wanted to. She'd also done something more personal, something that felt both terrifying and necessary. She'd invited Thomas to her apartment for dinner, along with Emma, ostensibly to discuss strategy, but really because she wanted to understand who this man actually was beyond the narrative of victim and genius that she'd constructed in her mind. They arrived at 7, Emma clutching a slightly crumpled drawing she'd made, Thomas looking profoundly uncomfortable in khakis and a button-down shirt that probably hadn't been worn in years. Rebecca's penthouse was all glass and steel and carefully curated modern art, the kind of space that appeared in architecture magazines and felt about as warm as a museum. And she watched Emma's eyes go wide as she took in the view of the city stretching out below them like a circuit board of lights. "This is where you live?" Emma asked with the brutal honesty of children everywhere. "It's so empty." Rebecca laughed despite herself, the observation hitting closer to truth than the 7-year-old probably realized. "It is pretty empty, isn't it? Maybe you could help me fix that." Emma brightened immediately, pulling out her drawing and presenting it with the solemnity of a diplomat offering a treaty. "I made this for you. It's you and Daddy and me, standing on a bridge. The bridge is broken, but we're fixing it together. See?" Rebecca took the drawing with hands that trembled slightly, staring at the crayon figures. A tall man, a small girl, and a woman with dark hair, all holding tools and working on a rainbow bridge that had a crack running through its middle. It was possibly the most beautiful thing anyone had ever given her. Dinner was awkward at first, the conversation stilted and careful, but Emma had a way of cutting through tension that adults spent years learning to create, asking questions about everything from why Rebecca didn't have any pets to whether rich people ever got lonely to what her favorite color was and why. Thomas watched his daughter with barely concealed pride, occasionally redirecting her when questions got too personal, but mostly just letting her be herself with an ease that spoke of years of single parenting and unconditional love. As they ate, Rebecca had ordered in from an absurdly expensive restaurant because her cooking skills were limited to coffee, and toast. The conversation gradually shifted to safer ground, to Emma's school and her friends and her passion for drawing and science in equal measure. "She wants to be an inventor," Thomas said quietly, his hand resting on his daughter's shoulder. "Says she's going to build things that help people and make sure everyone knows who built them so nobody can steal the credit." Emma nodded seriously. "Like what happened to Daddy. I'm going to make sure everyone knows when I make something good, so bad people can't take it." Rebecca felt her throat tighten, this child's understanding of injustice both heartbreaking and somehow hopeful, proof that the next generation might build something better if given half a chance. "That's a wonderful goal, Emma," she said softly. "And I promise you, I'm going to make sure that what happened to your dad never happens to you or anyone else if I can help it." After dinner, Emma fell asleep on Rebecca's obscenely expensive couch, curled up like a kitten with her head on a cushion that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and Thomas and Rebecca found themselves standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city and finally having the conversation they'd been dancing around all evening. "I need to know," Rebecca said quietly, if we do this, if we go public with everything, are you ready for what comes next? The media attention, the scrutiny, the way your entire life becomes public property? Emma's life too, by extension? Thomas was silent for a long moment, his reflection in the glass looking tired and thoughtful. I've spent 7 years being invisible, he said finally. Part of me wants to stay that way, wants to just keep my head down and keep Emma safe and not rock the boat. But another part of me, the part that Anna fell in love with, the part that believed building things mattered, that part knows that staying silent is just another way of letting them win. Rebecca nodded, understanding more than she could articulate. My father used to say that power was about controlling the narrative, about making sure your version of events was the only one people heard. I think that's what I'm most afraid of, that even if we tell the truth, people will find ways to dismiss it, to twist it, to make us the villains in a story where we're trying to do the right thing. Thomas turned to look at her directly, and his eyes held a kind of weary wisdom that came from surviving things that should have broken him. The truth doesn't always win, Rebecca. I learned that the hard way. But that doesn't mean it's not worth fighting for. Because even if we lose, even if the board votes you out and buries this whole thing, at least Emma will grow up knowing her father didn't stay silent when it mattered. At least she'll learn that some things are worth the risk. The vote was scheduled for Friday morning at 9, and by 8:45, the boardroom was packed not just with board members, but with lawyers and advisors and representatives from major shareholders who demanded to be present for what everyone knew would be a pivotal moment in the company's history. Rebecca had barely slept the night before, running through scenarios and contingencies and trying to prepare for every possible outcome. But as she walked into that room and saw the faces arrayed against her, she realized that all the preparation in the world couldn't account for the simple human fear of watching everything you'd built crumble because you'd chosen principle over pragmatism. Daniel Kowalski started the meeting, his voice smooth and reasonable in that particular way that made Rebecca's skin crawl because she recognized it from her father's playbook, the tone that made unreasonable things sound perfectly logical. We all respect Rebecca's passion and her commitment to ethical business practices, he began, his words carefully chosen for the lawyers in the room. But we have a fiduciary responsibility to our shareholders, and what she's proposing would constitute a fundamental breach of that responsibility. We cannot, in good conscience, vote to expose this company to unlimited legal and financial liability based on events that occurred under previous leadership and which, I might add, have never been subjected to any legal scrutiny or judgment. Rebecca had prepared for this argument, had a response ready about long-term value and reputation management and the cost of cover-ups. But before she could speak, the conference room door opened and Thomas Fisher walked in, not in maintenance coveralls, but in a suit that fit him perfectly, carrying a leather portfolio and looking every inch the senior engineer he'd once been and should have remained. He nodded to Rebecca, then turned to face the board, and when he spoke, his voice carried a quiet authority that made everyone lean forward slightly despite themselves. My name is Thomas Fisher, and I'm here to offer you all a choice. Thomas walked to the front of the room with the kind of calm that comes from having nothing left to lose and everything to gain, and Rebecca watched the board members' faces shift from confusion to recognition to something that might have been respect or might have been fear. It was hard to tell the difference sometimes. He set his portfolio on the table and opened it, pulling out a stack of documents that he distributed with methodical precision, one copy to each board member, one to each lawyer, one to Gregory Walsh, who looked like he'd just swallowed something bitter. These are the original development files for the predictive analytics system that built this company, Thomas said, his voice steady and clear. Complete code repositories, design documents, testing logs, all with my digital signature and timestamps that prove beyond any legal doubt that I created this technology while employed here between 2012 and 2014. I also have documentation showing that I attempted to file a formal complaint about intellectual property theft in early 2015, shortly before my wife died, and that complaint was buried by your legal department with the assistance of Mr. Kowalski and Mr. Walsh. The room exploded into chaos, board members shouting questions, lawyers frantically scanning documents, Daniel Kowalski standing up and slamming his hand on the table hard enough to make coffee cups jump. But Thomas just waited, patient as stone, until the noise died down enough for him to continue speaking. Here's the choice I'm offering you, he said, and Rebecca heard something in his voice that made her spine straighten, a core of steel beneath the quiet exterior that she'd underestimated until this moment. You can vote with Rebecca, acknowledge what happened, work with me to build something better, and face whatever consequences come from honesty with your heads held high and a chance at redemption. Or you can vote against her, try to bury this again, and I will take these documents to every media outlet, every regulatory agency, every competitor who'd love to see Hartman Technologies destroyed, and I will make sure the world knows exactly what kind of company you've been running. Not as revenge, not as punishment, but because I have a daughter who's watching how this plays out, and I will not teach her that powerful people get to steal and lie and face no consequences. The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of silence that feels like the world holding its breath before something fundamental changes. Sarah Chun was the first to speak, her lawyer's voice cutting through the tension with surgical precision. Mr. Fisher, what you're describing could be considered extortion. Thomas smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. No, Ms. Chun, what I'm describing is called leverage. Extortion would be if I was demanding money or personal benefit. All I'm demanding is honesty and credit for work I did, which is called justice. Your legal team can debate the semantics all you want, but we both know that whether or not I have the legal right to do what I'm threatening, I have the practical ability to do it, and that's what matters here. Rebecca watched the calculation happening in real time, saw the exact moment when the board members realized they'd been outmaneuvered not by corporate strategy or legal maneuvering, but by simple moral clarity backed by devastating evidence. Gregory Walsh was sweating now, his earlier confidence evaporating as he realized that the comfortable world of plausible deniability had just collapsed around him. Daniel Kowalski looked like he'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes. The reality sinking in that his loyalty to Rebecca's father had put him on the wrong side of a line that couldn't be uncrossed. And the other board members, the ones who'd been sitting on the fence, waiting to see which way the wind blew, they were now frantically reassessing their positions, recognizing that the safe choice had suddenly become the dangerous one, and the dangerous choice had somehow become the only path forward that didn't end in complete destruction. Thomas continued, his voice softening slightly, but losing none of its strength. I don't want to destroy this company. Despite everything, I'm proud of what my work became, proud that it saved lives even if it couldn't save the one that mattered most to me. What I want is for my daughter to grow up in a world where creating something matters more than owning something, where the people who do the actual work get actual recognition, where companies can admit mistakes and correct course instead of doubling down on lies until they collapse under the weight of their own deception. That's what Rebecca is offering you, a chance to be better than you've been. I suggest you take it. The vote, when it finally came after another hour of heated debate and desperate attempts to find a middle ground that didn't exist, was closer than Rebecca had hoped, but clearer than she'd feared. 7 in favor of her proposal, 5 against. It wasn't the unanimous mandate she'd wanted, but it was enough, barely enough, to move forward with a plan that would either resurrect the company as something worth believing in or tear it down in flames of honesty that would at least burn clean. The press conference was scheduled for the following Monday, giving them just enough time to prepare statements and brace for impact, but not enough time for opponents to organize effective resistance. Rebecca spent those 72 hours in a blur of meetings with PR consultants and lawyers, drafting and redrafting the announcement that would change everything, while Thomas worked with the engineering team to prepare a demonstration of the original technology alongside the bastardized version the company had been selling, visual proof of exactly what had been stolen and how much better it could have been if developed properly. Emma spent those days in Rebecca's office, having been given an impromptu week off from school, drawing elaborate pictures of bridges and buildings and families holding hands, her child's optimism a strange counterweight to the adult anxiety permeating every conversation and decision. On Monday morning, as Rebecca stood backstage at the press conference venue watching hundreds of journalists and cameras set up in an auditorium that suddenly felt far too small, she felt her father's absence like a physical presence, wondering what he would think of what she was about to do, whether he'd see it as betrayal or evolution or simply weakness. Thomas appeared beside her, Emma holding his hand and looking simultaneously excited and nervous in a dress that was probably her nicest one, and he seemed to read her thoughts with uncanny accuracy. He'd hate this, Thomas said quietly, not unkindly. Your father would see this as weakness, as surrender, as everything he built his life to avoid. But that's okay, because he was wrong about a lot of things, and one of them was the idea that admitting fault makes you weak. Rebecca looked at him, this man who'd survived so much and somehow emerged with his integrity intact, and felt something shift in her chest, a letting go of the need to be her father's daughter and an embracing of the possibility of being simply herself. Then let's go show the world what strength actually looks like, she said, and together they walked onto that stage, into the lights and the cameras and the future they were about to create. The words came easier than she'd expected, the truth having a kind of momentum that lies never possessed. And as she laid out the full story, her father's theft, Thomas's loss, the company's complicity, and their plan to make things right, she watched faces in the audience shift from skepticism to shock to something that might have been hope. Thomas spoke next, his engineer's precision making complex technology understandable, his personal story making abstract concepts concrete. And when Emma stepped forward at the end to present a drawing she'd made, a picture of a broken bridge rebuilt stronger, with the caption, "Sometimes the best things are made by people who know what breaking feels like," there wasn't a dry eye in the room, including Rebecca's own. The questions that followed were brutal and probing and exactly what they'd prepared for. Journalists smelling blood, but also sensing something larger, a narrative of redemption that was rare enough in corporate America to be genuinely newsworthy. And through it all, Rebecca felt her father's ghost finally releasing its grip on her shoulders, felt the weight of inherited sin lifting as she chose a different path, a harder path, but one she could finally walk without shame. The next 6 months were chaos of the productive kind, reorganizing the company from top to bottom, establishing new oversight procedures, launching the foundation in Anna Fisher's name, and watching Thomas transform from invisible maintenance worker to celebrated innovator as the tech world collectively realized what they'd missed. Emma started at a new school, one where her classmates' parents all knew her father's story and treated her not with pity but with pride, and she continued drawing her bridges and buildings with an added element: now foundations, strong and visible and honestly built. And Rebecca learned something her father never understood, that sometimes tearing down what's broken and rebuilding it properly takes more courage than maintaining comfortable lies. That true strength isn't about never falling, but about how you choose to stand back up. And that the best legacies aren't the ones we inherit, but the ones we create when we finally find the courage to do what's right instead of what's easy. The company survived, smaller than before but stronger, built on truth instead of theft. And when Rebecca stood in the rebuilt lobby months later, looking at the plaque that read Fisher-Hartmann Technologies, founded on innovation, rebuilt on integrity, she finally understood what her father never could: that some things are worth more than profit, and the most valuable thing you can build isn't an empire. It's a future where the people who create be.